Welcome, listeners, to another story from our mysterious past history. Today we are going to listen to a story called Blood and Iron, the rise and fall of Rome. Get ready to dive into an epic journey through power, betrayal, and ambition as we unravel the story of Rome, from its mythical beginnings to its transformation into the greatest empire the world has ever known. With legendary figures, epic battles, and shocking twists, this tale will keep you on the edge of your seat. Tune in and experience the drama, the glory, and the unforgettable legacy of Rome. In the heart of ancient Italy, amidst the rolling hills and fertile plains, a new city was born, a city destined to rule the world. Rome's origin is steeped in myth and legend, a tale of brothers, betrayal, and the will of the gods. Its birth was as fierce as its rise, fueled by ambition, bloodshed, and a desire for glory. The myth of Romulus and Remus, twin sons of the god Mars and the princess Rhea Silvia, would forever be etched into Rome's history. Abandoned by their mother and left to die in the Tiber River, the twins were saved by a she-wolf who nurtured them in her cave, the Lupercal. It was here that the brothers' journey began, as they grew strong and determined to fulfill their destiny. But the world they entered was not one of peace. It was a world of violence and strife, where tribes fought for control of territory, and the gods demanded tribute in blood. The brothers, now young men, sought revenge against their great uncle, King Amulius, who had taken the throne of Alba Longa by force and had killed their father. Romulus and Remus, determined to restore their rightful lineage, led a revolt that expelled Amulius and reinstated their grandfather, King Numitor, to the throne. But even with their family restored, the brothers had unfinished business. They desired to found a new city, a place that would carry their bloodline and their name into the future. They journeyed to the banks of the Tiber River, where Romulus chose the Palatine Hill, a place of strategic advantage, to build the city. Remus, ever the challenger, disputed his brother's choice, mocking the decision. In a tragic turn of events, Remus was killed by Romulus during a quarrel, marking the first act of bloodshed in the city's history. Romulus, now the sole ruler, declared the city of Rome founded in 753 BCE. The city, like its founder, was destined for greatness. Its walls built on blood and ambition, its heart beating with the will of the gods. The legend of Rome's birth, though shrouded in myth, became the cornerstone of its identity, a city born of battle, power, and divine favor. Rome's early days were defined by the reign of kings, each ruler more ambitious than the last. Romulus, the first king, expanded the city's borders and established its military. But as Rome grew, so did the desire for greater representation and control. The monarchy, once seen as a symbol of Rome's strength, became a threat to its future. The last of the Roman kings, Tarquin the Proud, ruled with cruelty and tyranny. His reign was marked by extravagance and oppression, and his disregard for the people of Rome led to a rebellion. Led by Brutus, a distant relative of Tarquin, the Romans rose up, overthrowing the monarchy and ending the reign of the kings. In 509 BCE, Rome transitioned from monarchy to republic. The Romans, having tasted freedom from tyranny, created a system of government where power was shared between elected officials and the people. The Senate, composed of noble families, became the heart of the new republic, while the consuls, two elected leaders, would serve as the executive heads of state. The republic was born from the ashes of the monarchy, with a new focus on representation, justice, and military prowess. But as Rome expanded, the strains of governing a growing empire would soon begin to show. The divide between the aristocracy and the common people, the patricians and plebeians, became more pronounced. Power struggles within the Senate and the rising ambition of military leaders set the stage for the conflicts that would shape Rome's future. The fall of the Roman monarchy marked a monumental shift in the history of Rome. What had once been a city governed by kings, their rule sanctioned by the gods themselves, was now a republic. Rome, still in its infancy, had freed itself from the shackles of tyranny, but its future was far from certain. The old system of kings had been replaced by a new order, a system founded on the principles of shared power, political checks and balances, and the belief that the will of the people was the guiding force of the state. In 509 BCE, the Senate, Rome's new governing body, was established as the backbone of the republic. It was comprised of noble families, known as the patricians, who held the true power of the state. Alongside the Senate, 2 consuls were elected annually by the people. These consuls, originally military commanders, would serve as the executive leaders of the state, wielding supreme authority during their term in office. Their power, however, was checked by the other consul and the Senate, whose members served as advisors and held sway over the laws of Rome. This new structure, born out of the ashes of the monarchy, was meant to protect the interests of the Roman people and ensure that no individual could rise to absolute power. Yet, while the ideals of the republic were noble, the realities of governance in a growing empire soon revealed the weaknesses of the system. Power, though theoretically distributed, was often monopolized by the few, and the clash between the patricians and the plebeians, the common people, became a defining feature of Roman politics. In the early days of the Republic, the patricians held almost all of the political power. They controlled the Senate, held most of the important offices, and were the only ones who could afford to serve in the military. The plebeians, on the other hand, were excluded from the Senate and had little say in the governing of Rome. Though they formed the bulk of the Roman population, they were largely seen as second-class citizens. The resentment between the two classes began to simmer almost immediately. The plebeians, who were often farmers, craftsmen, and laborers, were burdened with heavy taxes and military service. They had no voice in the Senate, and their lives were dictated by the decisions of the patricians. As Rome expanded, the plebeians were often the ones who fought in the wars to secure new territories, only to return home to find their lands taken by wealthy patricians or heavily taxed. The tension between the classes erupted into open conflict when the plebeians, seeking to secure their rights, began a series of protests known as the secessions. These were moments when the plebeians, frustrated by their lack of political representation and rights, would refuse to serve in the military or work for the state. In one of the earliest secessions, in 494 BCE, the plebeians withdrew from Rome entirely and set up their own camp on the Mont Seher, sacred mountain, just outside the city. The patricians, realizing that they could not defend Rome without the plebeians, were forced to negotiate. It was during this time that the tribunes of the plebs were created, officials who would represent the plebeians in the Senate. These tribunes were given the power to veto decisions made by the Senate and to propose legislation on behalf of the plebeians. The creation of the tribune was a significant step toward political equality in Rome, though the patricians continued to hold the majority of power. The struggle between the patricians and plebeians over political power was not limited to the Senate. One of the most important outcomes of this conflict was the creation of the 12 Tables, the first written laws. O Rome! Before the 12 Tables, the laws of Rome were passed down orally, creating uncertainty and allowing the patricians to manipulate the legal system to their advantage. The plebeians, frustrated by their inability to understand the laws that governed their lives, demanded that the laws be written down. In 450 BCE, a commission of 10 men was appointed to codify the laws. After much deliberation, the 12 Tables were publicly displayed in the Roman Forum for all to see. These laws, though, simple and often harsh, provided a foundation for Roman legal theory and marked a significant victory for the plebeians. They could now appeal to the law, and the law, at least in theory, applied equally to both the patricians and the plebeians. The 12 tables addressed a variety of topics, from property rights to the punishment of crimes. Some of the laws were brutal by modern standards, such as the requirement that debtors be sold into slavery if they could not pay their debts. However, the 12 tables also marked a step toward fairness and equality, ensuring that legal decisions were made according to written laws rather than the whims of the ruling class. As the political conflict between the patricians and plebeians simmered, Rome's military might continued to grow. In the early years of the Republic, Rome's military was composed mostly of landowners who were able to afford their own equipment. However, as the Roman army expanded to meet the demands of conquest, the plebeians began to play an increasingly important role. In the mid-4th century BCE, the Camillian reforms, named after the general Gaius Marcius Coriolanus, restructured the Roman military. These reforms allowed the plebeians to serve in the army, regardless of their wealth, and provided them with standardized equipment. This shift made the Roman army one of the most effective military forces in the ancient world. Rome's military campaigns during the early Republic were focused on expanding its territory within Italy. The Romans fought wars against the Samnites, the Etruscans, and the Gauls, all of whom were major threats to Rome's survival. These wars were brutal and long-lasting, but they resulted in the eventual domination of the Italian peninsula by Rome. The success of Rome's military campaigns allowed the Republic to expand its influence and begin the process of building an empire. Roman legions, highly disciplined and well-organized, began to conquer the lands surrounding Italy, starting with the Greek cities in the southern part of the peninsula. Rome's military prowess, combined with its growing political influence, soon made it the dominant power in the Mediterranean. As Rome's power grew, so did its enemies. The most formidable of these was Carthage, a wealthy and powerful city-state located in North Africa. The Carthaginians had long been a major force in the Mediterranean, with a powerful navy and control over vast trade routes. Rome, eager to expand its influence and secure its holdings in Italy, began to clash with Carthage over control of the island of Sicily, which lay at the crossroads of the Mediterranean. In 264 BCE, the First Punic War broke out between Rome and Carthage. The conflict would last for over 20 years, with both sides suffering heavy losses. Despite their lack of naval experience, the Romans were able to build a powerful fleet and engage the Carthaginian navy. The war was fought on both land and sea, with significant battles such as the Battle of Mylae and the Battle of the Aegates Islands. The war ended in 241 BCE with a decisive Roman victory, and Carthage was forced to cede control of Sicily to Rome. This victory marked Rome's first major step toward becoming a dominant power in the Mediterranean. With the defeat of Carthage and the acquisition of new territories, Rome began to show the strains of empire. The power struggles between the patricians and plebeians continued to simmer beneath the surface. The growing divide between the wealthy elite and the common people would soon boil over into full-scale conflict. As the Senate grew more corrupt, and military leaders like Gaius Marius and Lucius Cornelius Sulla rose to prominence, the Roman Republic began to falter. The ideal of a government where power was shared between the Senate and the people was increasingly undermined by military leaders who used their armies to pursue their own ambitions. Rome, once a beacon of democratic ideals, was now caught in a cycle of political infighting, military coups, and social unrest. The events of the next several decades would set the stage for the eventual fall of the Republic and the rise of the Roman Empire. By the middle of the 3rd century BCE, Rome had firmly established itself as the dominant power on the Italian peninsula. Its victory over the Samnites and its successful expansion into the southern territories of the peninsula had secured its position. Yet, as Rome's borders pushed ever outward, it encountered its first major threat beyond the Italian peninsula, the mighty city-state of Carthage. Carthage, located on the northern coast of Africa, was one of the greatest maritime powers of the ancient world. Its wealth stemmed from its control over vital trade routes in the Mediterranean and its mastery of naval warfare. While Rome had established itself as a dominant land power, Carthage was unrivaled at sea. The two powers, each on the rise in their respective domains, began to collide over control of the strategically important island of Sicily, which lay in the heart of the Mediterranean and was central to both Roman and Carthaginian trade interests. At the time, Sicily was home to a mix of Greek colonies, local indigenous tribes, and cities controlled by Carthage. Rome, eager to secure its influence and expand its reach, began to intervene in the island's politics. What started as a relatively small conflict soon escalated into one of the largest and most important wars in ancient history, the First Punic War. In 264 BCE, Rome and Carthage found themselves at odds over Sicily, when a group of Sicilian mercenaries, known as the Mamertines, sought Rome's assistance to defend their city of Messana from a Carthaginian attack. Rome seized the opportunity to expand its influence on the island. Carthage, in turn, saw Rome's interference as a direct threat to its dominance in the Mediterranean. What followed was a brutal war, fought both on land and sea, that would stretch for over 20 years. The First Punic War, although initially small, would come to define the future of both Rome and Carthage, altering the balance of power in the ancient world. The war's first phase saw Roman armies clashing with Carthaginian forces on the island of Sicily, but it quickly became apparent that the real contest lay at sea. Carthage, with its superior naval fleet, was able to blockade the Roman ports and challenge Roman supremacy in the Mediterranean. Rome, however, was not easily deterred. Unlike Carthage, which relied heavily on its experienced mercenaries and its established naval force, Rome was a relatively new player in naval warfare. Yet, the Romans were known for their ability to adapt and innovate. Rather than being intimidated by Carthage's naval superiority, Rome invested in shipbuilding and quickly learned how to navigate the waters of the Mediterranean. Rome's first major breakthrough in the war came in 260 BCE, when the Romans built a fleet of warships designed for battle at sea. What set the Romans apart was their introduction of the corvus, a type of boarding device that allowed Roman soldiers to board enemy ships and fight hand-to-hand. The corvus allowed the Romans to take advantage of their superior infantry and turn naval battles into battles of Roman might and discipline, rather than relying on naval tactics alone. The Battle of Mylae in 260 BCE, one of the first major naval engagements between the Romans and Carthaginians, marked a turning point in the war. Despite their inexperience, the Roman fleet used the corvus to devastating effect, defeating the Carthaginian navy. The victory gave Rome the confidence it needed to continue its campaign and prove that it was not simply a land power. It was capable of contesting the Mediterranean. Over the next few years, the war would move back and forth between land and sea, with the Romans winning several key naval battles. By 241 BCE, Rome had managed to secure control of most of Sicily and had inflicted significant damage on Carthage's naval fleet. The long and exhausting nature of the war, combined with Rome's growing naval capabilities, forced Carthage to sue for peace. In 241 BCE, the First Punic War came to an end, with Rome emerging as the victor. Rome's victory in the First Punic War marked a monumental shift in the balance of power in the Mediterranean. The Carthaginian Empire, once dominant at sea, had been crippled. Rome, once a relatively small regional power, had now gained control over Sicily, becoming the first Roman province. Carthage was forced to pay a heavy indemnity and cede control of its holdings on the island. While Rome celebrated its victory, Carthage, though defeated, was not broken. The costs of the war had been staggering, but the Carthaginian leaders vowed to rebuild and regain their former glory. They would not go quietly into defeat. This would be a lesson that Rome would soon learn all too well. In the years following Rome's victory, Carthage slowly recovered from the wounds of war. Though weakened by the financial strain of the conflict, the Carthaginian elite was determined to rebuild their navy and army. The focus shifted from Sicily to Spain, where Carthage sought to establish new colonies and strengthen its hold on the western Mediterranean. In the wake of Carthage's recovery, a new leader emerged, Hannibal Barca, the son of the great Carthaginian general Hamilcar Barca. Hannibal had grown up during the aftermath of the First Punic War, witnessing his father's oath to destroy Rome. His hatred of Rome was deeply personal, and he vowed to avenge the loss of Carthage's dominance. Hannibal's genius as a military strategist soon became evident. In 218 BCE, he led an army across the Alps into Italy, taking Rome completely by surprise. His audacious move was a direct challenge to Rome's dominance and set the stage for one of the most famous conflicts in history, the Second Punic War. The Second Punic War began in 218 BCE with Hannibal's invasion of Italy. The Roman Senate, caught off guard by the speed and aggression of his attack, struggled to respond. Hannibal's army, though vastly outnumbered, was a formidable force, composed of seasoned soldiers and war elephants. He marched through Italy, winning a series of decisive victories at Trebia, Lake Trasimene, and the infamous Battle of Cannae in 216 BCE, where he annihilated a much larger Roman force. The Romans were left reeling in the wake of these defeats, with their military reputation shattered. Yet, despite Hannibal's success on the battlefield, Rome refused to surrender. Instead, they adopted a strategy of attrition, led by Fabius Maximus, who advocated for avoiding direct engagement with Hannibal's army. Rome began to wear down Hannibal's forces, slowly cutting off his supplies and weakening his position. Despite Hannibal's impressive military achievements, his campaign in Italy lacked the reinforcements and resources necessary to maintain a prolonged war. The situation for Carthage grew desperate as Rome's resilience and strategic response began to take its toll. At the same time, Rome was shifting its focus to Spain, where the Carthaginians had established strongholds. The tide of the war began to turn when Scipio Africanus, a Roman general, led a successful campaign in Spain, eventually forcing Carthage to retreat from the Iberian Peninsula. In 202 BC, Scipio faced Hannibal at the Battle of Zama in North Africa. The battle was a decisive Roman victory, and Hannibal, forced to retreat, finally agreed to peace terms. The Second Punic War ended in 201 BCE with Carthage's defeat. The Carthaginian Empire, once Rome's greatest rival, was now a shadow of its former self. Carthage was forced to pay heavy reparations, give up its fleet, and abandon its imperial ambitions. Rome, on the other hand, emerged as the undisputed power in the Mediterranean. Its victory over Carthage marked the beginning of Rome's imperial expansion. Rome's armies would go on to conquer the Greek city-states, the Near East, and eventually much of North Africa, expanding the Republic into a vast empire that would last for centuries. But the shadow of Carthage, though defeated, would continue to linger in Roman memory. The Carthaginian legacy, especially the brilliance of Hannibal as a military leader, would haunt Rome for generations. Carthage's fall had cleared the way for Rome's rise, but it had also taught Rome a valuable lesson. The price of victory was always high, and its enemies would never forget their defeats. In the aftermath of the Punic Wars, Rome had emerged victorious, but forever changed. The Republic once founded on ideals of shared power between the Senate and the people, now found itself on the brink of transformation. The expanding empire brought immense wealth and land, but it also intensified the internal struggles between the powerful aristocracy, the patricians, and the common people, the plebeians. As Rome's territory grew, so did its wealth, yet the benefits of that wealth were not evenly distributed. While the elite families controlled vast estates, much of the land previously owned by Roman soldiers, especially those returning from the war, was absorbed into large latifundia, massive agricultural estates that relied on slave labor. The working class, citizens who had once made up the backbone of Rome's military power, found themselves displaced, impoverished, and disenfranchised. The contrast between the lives of the patricians and plebeians became ever more pronounced. The plebeians, farmers, laborers, and artisans, struggled to survive while the patricians basked in luxury. And it was not just economic inequality that divided the classes. Political power was also heavily skewed in favor of the elite. While the plebeians had a few representatives in the Senate, they had little power compared to the patricians, who held most of the consulships and offices of state. Tensions between these two groups reached a boiling point, setting the stage for political unrest and social conflict. For centuries, the plebeians had been denied the right to hold high offices and had been subjected to laws that they could not. Influence. The Senate, dominated by the patricians, made decisions that heavily favored the elite while leaving the plebeians powerless. The desire for equality within the republic began to rise, and the plebeians began to demand more rights. The first significant clash between the two classes came with the conflict of the orders, a series of political struggles in the 5th century BCE. The plebeians, frustrated by their lack of power, began withdrawing from the city and refusing to fight in the army until their demands were addressed. Their first major victory came in 494 BCE, when the Senate, seeing the disruption of the economy and military, agreed to create the office of the tribune of the plebs. This office would represent the plebeians in the Senate and had the power to veto any law that was seen as harmful to the common people. The creation of the tribunes was a victory for the plebeians, but it did not mark the end of their struggles. Over the next century, the plebeians continued to push for greater political influence. One of their greatest victories came with the Law of the 12 Tables, 450 BCE, a written legal code that ensured all citizens, including the plebeians, had access to the laws that governed their lives. For the first time, the legal system was made transparent, and the patricians could no longer use their power to manipulate the law to their advantage. The plebeians, however, continued to fight for greater rights. The next major step came in the 4th and 3rd centuries BCE with the Lex Hortensia, 287 BCE, which gave the decisions made by the plebeian assembly, or plebiscita, the full force of law. This meant that the plebeians could now enact laws that affected the entire Roman population, not just their own class. This marked the final step in the plebeians' fight for political equality. While the plebeians had won political victories, through their struggles, economic inequality remained an entrenched problem. Rome's wars of expansion had left the common people in dire straits. Many soldiers, returning from battle, found that their lands had been taken over by wealthy patricians, forcing them into poverty. The rise of large estates worked by slaves pushed many farmers out of work, creating a growing class of landless. Poor. It was during this period of economic hardship that the Gracchi brothers Tiberius and Gaius emerged as champions for the plebeians. Both were reform-minded politicians, and they sought to address the growing disparity between the wealthy, elite, and the common people. They proposed land reforms aimed at redistributing public land to the poor, who had been displaced by the expansion of large estates. Tiberius Gracchus, elected as tribune in 133 BCE, was the first to push for land reforms. He introduced a law that limited the amount of public land any individual could hold and ordered that excess land be distributed to the poor. Tiberius' proposals were met with fierce opposition from the Senate, whose members were among the largest landowners in Rome. When Tiberius attempted to bypass the Senate and implement the law directly, the Senate responded with violence. In 133 BCE, Tiberius was assassinated by a group of senators, and his land reforms were left unfinished. Despite his death, Tiberius' reforms left an indelible mark on Rome. His brother Gaius Gracchus, elected as tribune in 123 BCE, picked up where Tiberius had left off. Gaius expanded on Tiberius' land reforms and introduced new measures aimed at reducing the economic gap between the rich and the poor. He proposed laws that would provide grain to the poor, and he even tried to establish Roman colonies in Italy and abroad to provide land for the landless. Like his brother, Gaius Gracchus faced stiff opposition from the Senate. When his reforms failed to gain traction, he became increasingly radical. In 121 BCE, after a series of riots and political battles, Gaius was killed, and his reforms were rolled back. Though his efforts to redistribute land were ultimately unsuccessful, the Gracchi brothers left a lasting legacy. They had shown the Roman people that it was possible to challenge the power of the elite, and their deaths highlighted the deep divisions within Roman society. The struggles between the patricians and plebeians, along with the continued economic unrest, set the stage for a new era of Roman politics, one in which military leaders would increasingly shape the course of history. The growing reliance on mercenaries and landless soldiers created a new class of generals who could wield the loyalty of their troops and challenge the political elite. One of the most significant military leaders of this period was Gaius Marius, a general who rose from humble beginnings to become one of Rome's most celebrated commanders. Marius reformed the Roman army, allowing the landless poor to enlist and creating a professional military force that was loyal not to the state, but to its generals. His reforms drastically changed the nature of Roman warfare and shifted the balance of power within the Republic. Marius' military successes, including his campaigns against the Germanic tribes in the 100s BCE, made him immensely popular with the people and his soldiers. However, his growing influence alarmed the Senate, which had traditionally held control over the military. Marius' rivalry with the Senate's chosen general, Lucius Cornelius Sulla, would become a defining moment in Roman history. Sulla, a nobleman and general, had fought alongside Marius, but became his bitter enemy. In 88 BCE, Sulla was appointed to lead a campaign against the kingdom of Mithridates in Asia Minor. When Marius managed to secure the command for himself, Sulla marched his army on Rome, a bold move that would mark the beginning of Rome's first civil war. The conflict between Marius and Sulla culminated in Sulla's victory, and he became Rome's dictator in 82 BCE. Sulla's reign was marked by a series of violent purges, during which his enemies were killed or exiled. Sulla's dictatorship, though short-lived, highlighted the growing power of military leaders and the fragility of the Republic. The Senate, once the supreme body of power in Rome, had been reduced to a tool of powerful generals. This marked the beginning of a trend that would continue for the next several decades. Military leaders, rather than political institutions, would determine the fate of Rome. As Rome's republic evolved, the power struggles between the patricians and plebeians, combined with the rise of powerful military leaders, would set the stage for the eventual collapse of the Republic. The tension between Rome's political institutions, military power, and the growing ambitions of individual generals created an unstable political environment. The rivalry between Marius and Sulla was just the beginning. The next generation of Roman leaders, including Pompey, Crassus, and Julius Caesar, would use their military power and political influence to challenge the Republic's fragile system. the formation of the first triumvirate between Pompey, Crassus, and Caesar marked the beginning of the end for the Roman Republic. But the most significant change came with Julius Caesar's rise to power. His military genius and political ambition would bring the Republic to the brink of collapse and usher in the reign of one man, an emperor, who would replace the Senate as the ruling power of Rome. In the years following the brutal dictatorship of Sulla, the Roman Republic was in disarray. The Senate, fractured and weakened by internal power struggles, could no longer maintain control over the empire's vast and growing territories. Social and political divisions between the patricians and plebeians were as deep as ever, and military leaders, emboldened by their power and influence, began to dominate the political landscape. It was within this climate of political chaos and uncertainty that Julius Caesar, a man of boundless ambition and unmatched talent, would rise to prominence. Born in 100 BC to a noble, but not particularly wealthy, family of the Iuli Julius, Caesar's early life was shaped by both privilege and struggle. The Iuli were an ancient patrician family, but their power had waned over the centuries. From an early age, Caesar demonstrated his remarkable intelligence, charm, and political acumen. His ambition, however, would not be satisfied with merely inheriting the status of his family. He sought to redefine the nature of Roman politics and elevate himself to heights that few could have imagined. Caesar's early political career was marked by a series of strategic alliances with powerful men. His connections with Pompey Magnus and Marcus Licinius Crassus, two of Rome's most powerful generals, would prove to be the key to his ascent. Together, they formed the first triumvirate, an informal political alliance aimed at consolidating their power and countering the influence of the Senate. Through his alliance with Pompey, Caesar gained the military support needed to rise through the ranks. His relationship with Crassus, the wealthiest man in Rome, ensured that Caesar had the financial backing to fund his political ambitions. In 60 BCE, Caesar was elected consul, the highest office in Rome, and his political influence grew rapidly. His first year in office was marked by his ambitious reforms, which included land redistribution for the poor and the granting of citizenship to Rome's allies. Though his reforms were opposed by the Senate, Caesar's ability to garner popular support among the plebeians allowed him to bypass the traditional political structures. His alliance with Pompey and Crassus, combined with his connections among the military and the people, made him one of the most powerful men in Rome. Caesar's political power was further solidified when he was given command of the Roman legions in Gaul, modern-day France, in 58 BCE. At the time, Gaul was a collection of tribal territories, often in conflict with one another and with Rome's growing empire. Caesar saw the opportunity to use his military campaigns in Gaul not only to expand Rome's borders, but also to cement his reputation as a military leader of extraordinary skill and ambition. Over the next 8 years, Caesar waged a series of campaigns against the Gallic tribes, ultimately bringing all of Gaul under Roman control. His Commentary de Bello Gallico, Commentaries on the Gallic War, written by Caesar himself, provided a detailed account of his victories and served as propaganda to solidify his popularity back in Rome. These accounts portrayed Caesar as a great leader who had brought civilization to the barbaric lands of Gaul. They also showcased his military genius, including his decisive victory over the Germanic tribes and his dramatic crossing of the Rubicon River, which would eventually set the stage for his rise to absolute power. But it was not just the conquests in Gaul that enhanced Caesar's power. It was the wealth and resources that his campaigns brought to Rome. The spoils of war filled the Roman coffers, and the loyalty of his legions, made up largely of non-Roman citizens who had benefited from his land grants, ensured that Caesar's personal power grew with every victory. The loyalty of his army was crucial Caesar knew that the key to Rome's political system was the loyalty of its military leaders. By 49 BCE, Caesar's political career had reached a tipping point. The first triumvirate had begun to fracture. Pompey, once Caesar's ally, had grown increasingly distrustful of his former partner. Crassus had died in 53 BCE during an ill-fated campaign in the east. With Pompey now aligned with the Senate and determined to limit Caesar's growing power, tensions between the two men reached a boiling point. In 50 BCE, the Senate, under the influence of Pompey, ordered Caesar to disband his army and return to Rome as a private citizen. Caesar knew that to comply would mean political death. His enemies in the Senate had already begun to strip him of his power and would use this opportunity to destroy his career and reputation. Caesar's decision was both bold and irreversible. In 49 BCE, Caesar famously crossed the Rubicon River, the boundary that separated his military command from Roman territory. By doing so, he violated Roman law and effectively declared war on the Republic. "The die is cast," Caesar reportedly said as he crossed the river, signifying that there was no turning back. Caesar's move forced Pompey and the Senate to respond, but they were caught off guard by the swiftness of Caesar's actions. Pompey, fearing the loss of his own power, fled Rome and assembled an army to challenge Caesar. The civil war that followed would see the end of the Roman Republic and the beginning of Caesar's rise to absolute power. The civil war between Caesar and Pompey was a defining moment in Roman history. Despite the fact that Pompey had the backing of the Senate and more resources, Caesar's tactical genius and his loyalty from the legions proved decisive. His army moved swiftly through Italy, defeating Pompey's forces in a series of key battles. The turning point came at the Battle of Pharsalus in 48 BCE. Pompey, outnumbered and outclassed by Caesar's forces, suffered a crushing defeat. Pompey fled to Egypt, hoping to find refuge, but his enemies there, fearing Caesar's wrath, had him assassinated. With Pompey's death, Caesar became the undisputed ruler of Rome. Caesar returned to Rome as a triumphant victor, celebrated by the people and hailed as dictator. But while his military successes made him immensely popular, his growing power alarmed many of Rome's traditional elites. The Senate, no longer in control, watched as Caesar implemented a series of sweeping reforms that altered the very nature of Roman governance. In 46 BCE, Caesar was appointed dictator for 10 years, a position that gave him near absolute power. The following year, he was named dictator for life, a title that solidified his dominance over Rome and signaled the end of the Republic's fragile political system. Caesar's reforms included land redistribution to the poor, debt relief, and the restructuring of Roman society to better integrate provinces into the fabric of the empire. But Caesar's ambition did not stop there. He initiated plans to further expand Rome's influence beyond the Mediterranean. His campaigns in Britannia and Gaul laid the groundwork for future Roman conquests. He began to draft a plan for the reorganization of the calendar, introducing the Julian calendar, which would remain in use for centuries. Despite these reforms, Caesar's increasing power and his autocratic rule alarmed many within the Senate. To them, Caesar was no longer the leader of a republic, but a king in all but name. The Senate, composed of men who had once prided themselves on their authority and independence, feared the loss of their privileges. They saw in Caesar's rule the rise of monarchy, and they were determined to act before it was too late. The tension between Caesar and the Senate reached its climax on the Ides of March in 44 BCE. A group of senators, led by Brutus and Cassius, conspired to assassinate Caesar. Many of the conspirators were once loyal to Caesar, including Brutus, who was believed to be Caesar's illegitimate son. They saw the assassination as a necessary act to restore the Republic and prevent Rome from becoming a kingdom under Caesar's rule. On the morning of March 15th, Caesar entered the Senate House, unaware of the plot against him. As he took his seat, the conspirators surrounded him. One by one, they struck him with daggers, and in the end, Caesar was stabbed 23 times. His death marked the end of an era in Roman history, the death of the Republic and the birth of the Roman Empire. When Caesar saw Brutus among his attackers, he is said to have uttered the famous words, "Et tu, Brute? And you, Brutus?" This final act of betrayal marked the ultimate tragedy in Caesar's rise. A man who had shaped Rome's future now lay dead at the hands of those he had trusted the most. Caesar's assassination did not restore the Roman Republic, as the conspirators had hoped. Instead, it set off a new cycle of civil war, with Caesar's supporters, Mark Antony and Octavian, his adopted son, clashing with the forces of Brutus and Cassius. The final outcome of this struggle would mark the end of the Roman Republic and the rise of Octavian, later known as Augustus, as the first Roman emperor. Caesar's legacy, though cut short, lived on. His reforms, his military conquests, and his vision for Rome set the stage for the empire that would last for centuries. His death sealed the fate of the Republic and confirmed the necessity of a single ruler to guide Rome's future. The atmosphere in Rome in the months leading up to the Ides of March was charged with tension. Julius Caesar, having risen to the position of dictator for life, was viewed by many as a man whose power had grown unchecked. While he was celebrated by the people for his reforms, his consolidation of power was deeply unsettling to the traditional Roman elite. The Senate, which had once been the heart of Roman governance, found itself powerless, its authority overshadowed by Caesar's rule. In the heart of this growing discontent was a group of conspirators, men who had once been close to Caesar, senators, soldiers, and former allies, who saw his rise as a direct threat to the Republic. They believed that the only way to save Rome from tyranny was to restore the power of the Senate. At the forefront of the conspiracy was Marcus Junius Brutus, a senator and military leader who was believed by some to be Caesar's illegitimate son. Brutus was a man torn between his loyalty to Caesar and his deep conviction that Rome's future could not be controlled by one man alone. Brutus was not alone in his feelings. Gaius Cassius Longinus, another senator and one of Caesar's most vocal critics, joined him in the plot to assassinate Caesar. Together, Brutus and Cassius recruited other senators to their cause, forming a secret cabal that would strike when the time was right. The conspirators, believing that they were saving the Republic from the rise of a king, carefully planned the murder. They knew that they had to act swiftly and decisively, or their efforts would be in vain. In the weeks leading up to the Ides of March, the conspiracy tightened its grip on the Senate. The conspirators, careful to avoid suspicion, began to spread rumors of a threat to Caesar's life. Some believed that Caesar had grown arrogant, flaunting his power as dictator. Others whispered that he was planning to crown himself king. Either way, the feeling was growing that the Republic had come to an end, and that Caesar, the man who had single-handedly changed the course of Roman history, had to die. As the day of the assassination approached, the signs and omens seemed to align in a way that foreshadowed the tragedy to come. Many of those close to Caesar began to warn him of the danger. A soothsayer named Sosigenes famously told Caesar, "Beware the Ides of March." Caesar, as was his nature, shrugged off the warning with characteristic bravado. He was a man of destiny, and nothing, least of all omens, would deter him from his purpose. On the eve of the Ides, Caesar's wife, Calpurnia, experienced a disturbing dream in which she saw Caesar's statues spouting blood. Terrified, she begged him not to go to the Senate the next day. Caesar, however, dismissed her fears, saying that death was inevitable and could come at any time. He chose to ignore her plea, perhaps because his own belief in his invincibility was so deeply entrenched. Caesar, in his mind, was beyond the reach of ordinary threats. Despite these warnings, Caesar's sense of confidence, perhaps even arrogance, remained undeterred. On the morning of March 15th, he prepared for his day at the Senate as if it were any other. His close associate, Mark Antony, who had once fought alongside him and supported his rise to power, was away on official business. Antony's absence would prove to be a key factor in Caesar's decision to attend the Senate meeting that fateful day. The Senate House, located in the theater of Pompey, was bustling with activity on the morning of March 15th, 44 BCE. Senators took their seats, some nervously glancing at one another, aware of the plot that was about to unfold. The conspirators had carefully timed their strike to ensure that Caesar would be alone, surrounded only by those they could manipulate. When Caesar entered the Senate House, he was surrounded by his loyal supporters, unaware of the threat that loomed over him. He was greeted with the usual flattery and praise, but even as he made his way to the front, the conspirators silently took their positions. The first blow came from Ceruleus Casca, one of the conspirators, who lunged at Caesar with his dagger. Caesar, caught off guard, tried to defend himself, but was quickly overwhelmed. The other conspirators rushed forward, each stabbing Caesar in a chaotic frenzy. Though wounded, Caesar attempted to fight back, but the sheer number of attackers made resistance impossible. As he was being stabbed, Caesar turned to see Brutus, his close confidant, among the attackers. In that moment, the great dictator of Rome, whose ambition had reshaped the course of history, understood that his fate was sealed. According to legend, Caesar's last words were, "Et tu, Brute? And you, Brutus?" The betrayal of his beloved friend cut him to the core, and with that final blow, Caesar collapsed to the ground, his life slipping away. The Senate House was filled with chaos, as Caesar's body lay in a pool of blood. The conspirators, having carried out their plan, stood in shock, realizing the gravity of their actions. They had killed a man who had been loved by the people, a man who had promised reform, and whose death would set off a storm of political turmoil in Rome. The conspirators fled the Senate House, but they did not immediately find the support they had hoped for. The people of Rome, once thrilled by Caesar's reforms, now found themselves in shock and mourning. Caesar's death left a void in the heart of Rome, one that no amount of rhetoric or political maneuvering could fill. Mark Antony, who had been away when the assassination occurred, returned to the city and took control of the situation. Though Antony had once been Caesar's loyal ally, he now became the man to navigate Rome's future. As he prepared to speak to the people, he knew that the city was on the brink of upheaval. The political power vacuum left by Caesar's death could easily turn into civil war. Antony, masterfully using the funeral of Caesar as a platform, delivered an impassioned speech that turned public opinion against the conspirators. He pointed to Caesar's will, which promised land and wealth to the Roman people, and he reminded the masses of Caesar's many achievements. A people, enraged by the murder of their beloved leader, turned on the Senate. The conspirators, who had hoped to restore the Republic, found themselves hunted and forced to flee the city. Caesar's assassination, intended to preserve the Republic, instead marked the final death knell of Rome's ancient political system. In the wake of his murder, Rome was thrown into a power struggle between those who had supported Caesar and those who had opposed him. The second triumvirate, Mark Antony, Octavian, Caesar's adopted son, and Marcus Aemilius Lepidus, was formed to avenge Caesar's death and to restore order. But this alliance would soon fracture, and the future of Rome would be shaped by the ambition of two men, Antony and Octavian. While the Republic died with Caesar, his spirit lived on through the ambitions of his successors. Octavian, eventually known as Augustus, would rise to become Rome's first emperor, ushering in a new era of imperial rule. The Senate, weakened and divided, could no longer control the fate of Rome, and the vision of a republic founded on shared power and democratic principles was gone forever. Caesar's death, though a blow to his supporters, ultimately paved the way for the empire that would dominate the known world. His reforms, his military campaigns, and his vision of a united Rome lived on in the policies of his successors, and his name became synonymous with power, ambition, and destiny. The death of Julius Caesar sent shockwaves through the Roman world. Caesar, once the most powerful man in Rome, had created an empire within the Republic, a power structure that was shattered the moment he was assassinated. His murder was supposed to restore the old ways of the Republic, but it did just the opposite. It set the stage for the rise of new powers that would eventually see the end of the Republic altogether. The conspirators, led by Brutus and Cassius, had hoped that Caesar's death would spark the revival of the Senate and the restoration of traditional Republican values. Instead, their actions plunged Rome into political chaos. While they had killed a man, they had also killed the last vestiges of the Republic. Caesar's death created a power vacuum, one that would be filled by those who were closest to him: his supporters, his family, and his military commanders. The two most powerful men to emerge from this chaos were Mark Antony, Caesar's loyal general and confidant, and Octavian, his adopted son and heir. Both men had the ambition, the military backing, and the political connections to seize power. What followed was not a return to the Republic, but a bitter and bloody civil war between two men who would reshape the future of Rome. The war between Antony and Octavian would be the final struggle for control of Rome. Octavian, only 18 years old when Caesar was assassinated, had inherited not just Caesar's name, but his political connections, his military strength, and his legacy. Despite his youth and relative inexperience, Octavian quickly recognized the opportunity that Caesar's death presented. He returned to Rome from his studies in Illyricum with a clear goal: to avenge Caesar's murder and claim the power that was rightfully his. The Senate, though still an institution of power, was deeply fractured and disillusioned. Octavian, leveraging his connection to Caesar, began to rally Caesar's veterans and supporters to his cause. Through his charisma and his ability to forge alliances with powerful figures in Rome, he began to gain support from the people and the legions. Octavian's ascent to power, however, was not without obstacles. Mark Antony, Caesar's closest ally and trusted general, also claimed to be Caesar's heir and sought to take control of Rome. Antony had the loyalty of Caesar's legions, the support of the Senate's more conservative elements, and the military experience to back up his claim to power. His first major move after Caesar's death was to position himself as the protector of Caesar's legacy. While Octavian began to make political alliances in Rome, Antony turned his attention to Gaul and the eastern provinces, where his command would give him an even greater advantage. His military campaigns in the east, including his dealings with Cleopatra, the Queen of Egypt, were seen as attempts to expand his power beyond the boundaries of Rome. For a time, Antony and Octavian appeared to cooperate, maintaining a delicate balance of power. They both joined forces with Marcus Aemilius Lepidus, forming the Second Triumvirate, an official alliance designed to avenge Caesar's death and defeat the conspirators. Together, they brought about the proscriptions, a brutal series of political purges in which their enemies, particularly the supporters of Brutus and Cassius, were killed or exiled. The first significant conflict between the conspirators and the forces of the Second Triumvirate came in 42 BCE at the Battle of Philippi in the eastern part of the empire. The armies of Brutus and Cassius, the leaders of the assassination plot against Caesar, had rallied their supporters in an attempt to reclaim control of Rome. But they were no match for the power of the triumvirs, who were backed by Caesar's loyal legions. The battle, fought in two phases, was a decisive victory for Octavian and Antony. Both Brutus and Cassius were defeated, and the conspirators' forces were scattered. Brutus, realizing the hopelessness of his position, took his own life, as did Cassius. Their deaths marked the end of the conspiracy and solidified the power of the Second Triumvirate. With the defeat of the conspirators, Rome was temporarily unified under the triumvirs, but the seeds of discord had already been sown. Though the Second Triumvirate had secured victory, the uneasy alliance between Octavian, Antony, and Lepidus began to unravel. The real battle for Rome's future had only just begun. The victory at Philippi was only the beginning of the struggle for power between Antony and Octavian. While they had been united in their goal of avenging Caesar's death, the two men were now rivals, each with their eyes set on becoming the undisputed ruler of Rome. Their alliance began to fray as their political, military, and personal ambitions clashed. One of the first signs of this tension came when Antony, having returned to the east, entered into a famous alliance with Cleopatra, the Queen of Egypt. Antony's relationship with Cleopatra was not just romantic, it was political. Cleopatra was not only the ruler of Egypt, but also a powerful and wealthy monarch whose resources Antony hoped to use to strengthen his position against Octavian. The union between Antony and Cleopatra was seen by Octavian and many Romans as an act of betrayal, a symbol of Antony's shifting loyalty toward the east and away from Rome. Octavian, already a skilled political operator, seized upon Antony's alliance with Cleopatra to turn public opinion against him. He portrayed Antony as a traitor to Rome, someone who was more interested in ruling over the East with Cleopatra than in preserving the values of the Roman Republic. He used his position in Rome to spread propaganda and gain the support of the Senate, further isolating Antony. The situation escalated when Antony, in 34 BCE, declared Cleopatra and their children as rulers of various eastern territories, even granting them titles that implied royal succession. Octavian, now thoroughly alarmed, denounced Antony in the Senate and accused him of attempting to undermine Roman authority. This declaration of war marked the beginning of a final conflict between the two men. The conflict between Octavian and Antony came to a head in 31 BCE at the Battle of Actium, a decisive naval battle fought off the coast of Greece. Both sides amassed huge fleets, with Octavian commanding a force led by his admiral Agrippa, and Antony relying on his fleet, supported by Cleopatra's ships. The battle itself was a turning point in Roman history. Antony and Cleopatra's fleet was defeated decisively, and their forces were forced to retreat. Despite his efforts, Antony could not recover from the defeat. Faced with the collapse of his position, Antony retreated to Egypt, where he and Cleopatra eventually committed suicide in 30 BCE. With their deaths, Octavian became the undisputed ruler of Rome. The defeat of Antony and Cleopatra marked the end of the civil wars that had plagued Rome for over a century. It also marked the end of the Roman Republic. Octavian, now known as Augustus, became the first emperor of Rome in the long period of political instability that had begun with Caesar's rise to power came to a close. In the wake of Antony and Cleopatra's deaths, Octavian returned to Rome as a hero. The Senate, now powerless in the face of his victory, offered him the title of Augustus, meaning the revered one. With this title, Augustus became the first emperor of Rome, though he cleverly maintained the appearance of a republic. The Senate, though weakened, still existed, but its power was now largely symbolic. Augustus held supreme authority, having consolidated control over the military, the economy, and the political apparatus of Rome. Augustus ushered in a new era, the Pax Romana, or Roman peace, an unprecedented period of stability and prosperity that would last for more than 2 centuries. Under his rule, Rome transformed from a republic riven by civil wars into an empire. that would dominate the Mediterranean world. Augustus implemented a series of reforms, including restructuring the military, improving the infrastructure of the empire, and securing Rome's borders. The Roman Empire, though still in its early stages, was now poised to enter its golden age. With the defeat of Mark Antony and Cleopatra at the Battle of Actium in 31 BCE, Octavian stood as the undisputed ruler of Rome. The Republic, once a beacon of shared power and democracy, was now a thing of the past. The assassination of Julius Caesar, though intended to preserve the traditional Roman system, had instead paved the way for one man's rise to absolute power. Octavian, the man who had triumphed in the civil wars, was poised to usher in a new era, a new Rome under his rule. But Octavian, ever the political strategist, knew that the transition from republic to empire could not be rushed. He understood that while he held military and political control, the appearance of the old Roman institutions, the Senate, the consulships, and the res publica, the people's affairs, must remain intact, for the people of Rome still cherished the idea of a republic, even if in name only. On the 13th of January, 27 BCE, Octavian made his move. In a grand ceremony before the Senate, he formally offered to relinquish his extraordinary powers, returning control of the empire to the Senate and the people. In a move that seemed to echo the traditional Roman respect for shared governance, Octavian declared that he was stepping down from the dictatorial powers he had held for over a decade. But in a brilliant stroke of political maneuvering, Octavian proposed something far more subtle and enduring. Rather than stepping down, he asked for and received the title Augustus, meaning the revered one, a title which conferred upon him divine status. While he formally gave up the title of dictator, he retained control over the key elements of the Roman state, including the military and the provinces. Augustus, now supreme in both name and function, had cleverly preserved his authority without openly declaring himself monarch. Thus began the reign of Emperor Augustus. The Roman Empire, as we know it, was born not through military conquest, but through the careful, strategic consolidation of power. Augustus knew that the success of his rule would depend on his ability to stabilize the empire and solidify his control. The years of civil war had left Rome fractured, with much of its infrastructure in ruin and its economy in disarray. The Senate, while still nominally in charge, was now a weak institution. Augustus understood that the Roman people needed more than military victories. They needed peace, prosperity, and reform. One of Augustus' first and most important reforms was the restructuring of the Roman military. The legions, which had been loyal to individual generals during the civil wars, were now placed firmly under Augustus' control. He created a professional army, loyal to the emperor, which was stationed along the empire's borders to defend against any external threats. Augustus also established a Praetorian Guard, an elite force tasked with protecting the emperor himself. Another key reform was the restructuring of Roman law. Augustus worked to standardize and codify laws across the empire, making them more accessible and fair to all citizens. He also introduced social laws that aimed to encourage marriage and family life, particularly among the Roman elite, in an effort to preserve Roman morals and the traditional family structure. Augustus passed laws that penalized adultery and encouraged the birth of children among the upper classes. These laws, while seen as controversial, were designed to strengthen the Roman state by promoting loyalty to the empire and maintaining social order. Augustus also focused on urban renewal. Rome, the heart of the empire, had grown into a sprawling, chaotic city with overcrowded slums and deteriorating public infrastructure. Augustus initiated ambitious public works projects, constructing roads, aqueducts, and public buildings that would not only improve the quality of life for Romans, but also solidify his legacy as the founder of a new, prosperous era. One of his most lasting achievements was the construction of the Pantheon, a temple dedicated to all Roman gods, symbolizing the unity and power of the empire. The reforms enacted by Augustus, combined with his military prowess, ushered in an era known as the Pax Romana, or Roman peace. This period, which lasted for over 2 centuries, marked the height of Roman power and influence across the Mediterranean and beyond. During the Pax Romana, the Roman Empire flourished economically, culturally, and politically. Augustus' careful management of the provinces ensured that Rome's vast territories were governed efficiently. The military, while stationed at the borders, rarely had to engage in large-scale warfare. Instead, Augustus focused on consolidating Rome's holdings through diplomacy and strategic alliances. The empire's borders were expanded into Germany, Britain, Spain, and North Africa, solidifying Rome's dominance in the Mediterranean. Trade flourished under Augustus, as Rome's vast network of roads and waterways allowed goods and ideas to flow freely throughout the empire. The Mediterranean Sea, once a battleground between Rome and Carthage, became a Roman lake, and its ports became centers of commerce and culture. Goods from all corners of the empire, grain from Egypt, wine from Gaul, and silk from the east were exchanged in Roman markets, and the wealth of the empire flowed into Rome, making it the richest city in the world. Culturally, the Pax Romana saw a renaissance in art, literature, and architecture. Under Augustus' patronage, poets like Virgil, Horace, and Ovid produced works that would become the foundation of Western literature. The Aeneid, written by Virgil, told the mythical story of Rome's founding and celebrated Augustus' reign as the fulfillment of Rome's destiny. Augustus' reign also saw the flourishing of Roman architecture, with grand structures like the Forum of Augustus, the Areopagus, and the Colosseum constructed to celebrate the empire's power and glory. While Augustus was undoubtedly the most powerful man in Rome, his reign was marked by a growing awareness of the challenges of maintaining power and securing the future of the empire. Augustus, childless by his first marriage, had to carefully manage his succession. In his later years, he adopted Tiberius, the son of his wife Livia, and made him his heir. The smooth transition of power, which Augustus had carefully planned, would become a crucial part of the empire's continued stability. However, Augustus' attempts to secure the imperial succession were not without difficulty. His own family was a source of tension, as political intrigue and personal ambition began to seep into the imperial court. Augustus' stepson, Tiberius, would eventually become the second emperor of Rome, but his reign was far from peaceful. Tiberius, while a capable military leader, was deeply mistrustful of those around him, and his reign was marked by paranoia and cruelty. The Julio-Claudian dynasty that Augustus had hoped to establish was not as secure as he had imagined. Despite these challenges, Augustus succeeded in laying the groundwork for an enduring empire. His careful management of Rome's finances, military, and legal systems ensured that the empire would continue to thrive long after his death. The ideals of Roman law, military discipline, and imperial governance that Augustus established would become the foundation for the emperors who followed him. Augustus died in 14 CE, having ruled Rome for more than 4 decades. His reign, though marked by periods of conflict and unrest, was ultimately a period of unprecedented peace and prosperity for the Roman world. Augustus was deified after his death, and his legacy lived on in the form of the empire he had created. Under his reign, Rome became the dominant power in the Mediterranean, its influence extending from the shores of Spain to the deserts of Egypt. Augustus' reforms had strengthened the state, and his vision for the empire laid the groundwork for centuries of Roman rule. The reign of Augustus is often considered the golden age of Rome, a time when the Roman people enjoyed relative peace, economic prosperity, and cultural flourishing. But the foundations of imperial rule that Augustus established also marked the beginning of a new chapter in Roman history, one in which the power of the emperor would become paramount, and the Roman Republic would exist only in the distant memories of the past. Under the rule of Augustus, the Roman Empire entered an era of unprecedented stability known as the Pax Romana, or the Roman Peace. This period, which lasted for over 2 centuries, marked the zenith of Roman power, with the empire stretching from the windswept islands of Britain to the sun-drenched deserts of Arabia. Augustus' reign had brought peace, prosperity, and territorial expansion. But beneath this veneer of success, there were secrets of ambition, betrayal, and the personal struggles of those who held power. In his later years, Augustus continued to solidify his rule, constantly balancing the interests of the Senate, the people, and the military. Though Rome was at peace, Augustus understood that his legacy depended not only on maintaining that peace, but also on ensuring the stability of the imperial family, which had become the new cornerstone of Rome's future. Augustus was determined to safeguard the future of the empire by managing the succession and ensuring the continuity of his rule. However, despite his careful planning, the imperial family was rife with intrigue, betrayal, and ambition. The very bloodline that Augustus hoped would carry Rome's legacy forward would, over time, become the empire's Achilles heel. The personal lives of the Julio-Claudian dynasty, the family line founded by Augustus, were far from the serene image of Roman glory that the emperor sought to project. Augustus had a complicated relationship with his family, which was marred by personal loss, ambition, and betrayal. One of the most significant issues was Augustus' stepson, Tiberius, whom he had adopted as his heir. Tiberius, a seasoned general, with military victories to his name, was seen by Augustus as the natural successor to the throne. However, their relationship was fraught with tension. Tiberius was known for his military brilliance, but he was also cold, distant, and suspicious. Augustus, hoping to create a stable and unified imperial family, often clashed with Tiberius over matters of governance and personal loyalty. While Augustus lived, Tiberius dutifully played the role of heir, but after Augustus' death in 14 CE, Tiberius ascended to the throne as the second emperor of Rome. His reign, though marked by several military successes, became increasingly paranoid and cruel. Tiberius withdrew from public life, retreating to the island of Capri, where his rule became characterized by increasing despotism. The image of a wise and just emperor quickly crumbled, and rumors of atrocities and secret executions of political enemies spread throughout the empire. His reign would become synonymous with fear, secrecy, and corruption, which tarnished the ideals of the early empire. Tiberius' successor, Caligula, the third emperor of Rome, would prove to be even more destructive to the imperial family's legacy. Caligula, initially beloved by the people for his youthful charm and energy, quickly descended into madness after a brief period of success. His reign, from 37 to 41 CE, was marked by bizarre behavior, extravagant spending, and a growing sense of tyranny. One of the most infamous aspects of Caligula's reign was his growing belief in his own divinity. He declared himself a god and ordered the construction of a temple dedicated to his worship. His cruelty extended to his family, his senators, and even the Roman people. He is said to have executed his closest allies on a whim, and his erratic decisions undermined the empire's stability. Caligula's rule ended abruptly when he was assassinated by his own guards in 41 CE, but the damage to the Julio-Claudian family was already done. Caligula's reign, built on terror and unchecked power, made it clear that the Roman Empire's leadership was becoming increasingly unstable. His murder was met with widespread relief, but it left a bitter legacy of chaos and political unrest. After Caligula's assassination, the throne passed to his uncle Claudius, the fourth emperor of Rome. Though Claudius was initially seen as weak and ineffective, he proved to be a capable ruler who brought much-needed stability to the empire. His military campaigns, particularly in Britain, expanded Rome's territory, and he worked to improve the administration of the empire. However, Claudius' reign was marred by personal and political scandals, particularly surrounding his marriage to his niece, Agrippina the Younger. Agrippina, a woman of great ambition and ruthless cunning, had longed for power and saw her marriage to Claudius as a means to secure it. Agrippina's ambitions led to one of the most notorious events of the Julio-Claudian dynasty, the murder of Claudius' son and Agrippina's stepson, Britannicus, to clear the way for her own son, Nero, to ascend the throne. Nero, who became emperor at the age of 16, was initially seen as a promising ruler. His mother, Agrippina, had high hopes for his reign, but it soon became clear that Nero had little interest in ruling with the wisdom of his predecessors. Instead, he sought to indulge his own passions, art, theater, and luxury, at the expense of the empire. His early reign, though marked by relative peace, quickly degenerated into scandal and violence. Nero's infamous reign saw the execution of his own mother, Agrippina, and several of his closest advisors. His public excesses and cruelty alienated the Senate, the army, and the people. One of the darkest moments of Nero's reign came in 64 CE, when a devastating fire ravaged Rome. Rumors spread that Nero himself had started the fire, either for his own amusement or to clear space for his grand architectural plans. As the fire raged, Nero, seemingly detached from the suffering of the people, retreated to his lavish palace, where he allegedly sang about the fall of Troy. In the wake of the fire, Nero blamed the Christians for the disaster, initiating a brutal persecution of the Christian community in Rome. His actions, combined with his increasing paranoia and tyranny, led to his downfall. In 68 CE, facing a rebellion from the provinces and growing unrest in Rome, Nero was declared a public enemy by the Senate and committed suicide, marking the end of the Julio-Claudian dynasty. The downfall of Nero left the empire in turmoil. With no clear successor, the throne passed to Galba, the first emperor of the year of the four emperors. Galba was soon overthrown, and the imperial throne passed to Otho, and then to Vitellius, before ultimately settling on Vespasian, founder of the Flavian dynasty. The fall of the Julio-Claudian dynasty marked the end of the first family to rule the Roman Empire, but it also revealed the deep vulnerabilities of the imperial system. Augustus had established the foundations of an empire that would last 4 centuries, but the power of the emperor, once consolidated, was difficult to maintain without stability and capable leadership. The struggles within the imperial family during the Julio-Claudian period exposed the dangers of personal ambition, intrigue, and the consolidation of power in a single ruler. Despite the chaos, the empire continued to endure, driven by the vast infrastructure that Augustus had put in place: roads, aqueducts, military discipline, and a bureaucracy that, though often corrupt, allowed Rome to function as the world's preeminent power. Even as the Julio-Claudian dynasty came to an end in blood and betrayal, the Roman Empire, though scarred, would continue its march toward greatness. Though the Julio-Claudian emperors were often marred by scandal, madness, and cruelty, their reigns laid the foundations for the imperial system that would dominate Rome for centuries. Augustus, despite his flaws, set in motion a new era of Roman governance, one in which the emperor wielded supreme authority. The imperial family's struggles, from Tiberius' paranoia to Caligula's madness and Nero's indulgence, provided lessons in the dangers of absolute power, yet they also demonstrated Rome's resilience in the face of turmoil. The Pax Romana, established under Augustus, would endure for several more centuries. Though the empire's internal struggles would never fully cease. Even as dynasties changed, the legacy of the Julio-Claudians, both their triumphs and their tragedies, continued to shape the fate of Rome. The glory of the empire, built on military might, infrastructure, and law, would outlast the chaotic reigns of its early emperors. Yet the secrets within the imperial court would remain, whispered through the ages as a reminder of the fragility of power. For centuries, the Roman Empire stood as the dominant force in the Mediterranean world. Its legions, its governance, and its culture were emulated by other civilizations. The reign of Augustus had established the foundation of the Pax Romana, and the centuries that followed were largely prosperous, with the empire at the height of its power. But beneath the surface of Roman greatness, cracks were beginning to form, cracks that would eventually lead to the slow, agonizing decline of what was once the most powerful empire the world had ever seen. The causes of Rome's eventual fall were complex and multifaceted. The decline was not the result of a single event, but rather a series of internal and external pressures that compounded over time. From political instability to economic troubles, from military overreach to invasions by barbarian tribes, the Roman Empire would crumble under the weight of its own excess and internal dysfunction. The beginning of the end for the Roman Empire is often traced back to the crisis of the 3rd century, 235 to 284 CE, a period of military, political, and economic instability. The empire, now divided into the eastern and western parts, was stretched, thin by constant warfare on multiple fronts. The sheer size of the empire had become a liability, with its borders increasingly difficult to defend from external threats. Meanwhile, internal strife, corruption, and civil war weakened Rome's ability to respond to these threats. During this period, the empire saw a succession of weak and ineffective emperors, often known as the barracks emperors. These emperors were frequently military leaders who came to power through force, rather than political legitimacy, and their rule was marked by constant instability. Over a period of 50 years, Rome would see 26 emperors rise and fall, many of them murdered in palace coups or overthrown by rival generals. As Rome's borders grew increasingly difficult to defend, it found itself under threat from multiple directions. In the east, the Persian Empire, an ancient rival, began to expand and encroach on Roman territories. In the north, the Germanic tribes, such as the Goths and the Franks, mounted repeated invasions. Meanwhile, the Sassanid Empire in Persia grew stronger, further draining Rome's military resources. In addition to external threats, the empire faced economic instability, the cost of maintaining the military, the constant threat of rebellion, and the infrastructure required to govern such a vast empire created severe financial strain. The Roman currency was debased, leading to inflation and a collapse in trade. At the same time, social unrest and class divisions within the empire grew, further destabilizing the region. The crisis of the 3rd century brought Rome to the brink of collapse. It was in this time of chaos that Diocletian, a military commander, rose to power in 284 CE. Recognizing the magnitude of the empire's problems, Diocletian set out to restore order and stabilize the empire. His reign marked a shift in Roman governance and the beginning of a new era, though one ultimately fraught with challenges. Diocletian's most significant reform was the division of the empire into 2 parts, the Eastern Roman Empire and the Western Roman Empire. The idea behind this division was to create a more manageable structure of governance, as the empire had grown too large to be effectively controlled by a single ruler. Diocletian took control of the Eastern Empire, while his co-emperor, Maximian, ruled the West. Along with his division of power, Diocletian also created the Tetrarchy, a system of rule where 2 senior emperors, known as Augusti, shared power with 2 junior emperors, known as Caesars. This system was meant to provide a more efficient and stable form of leadership. While this division helped to some extent, it also laid the groundwork for further internal division and eventually civil war, as future emperors sought to consolidate power for themselves. Diocletian also sought to reform the military, increase tax revenues, and curb the growing inflation that plagued the empire. His policies, which included price controls and forced labor, were unpopular and often difficult to enforce. Nonetheless, his reign brought a temporary period of stability to the empire, and Diocletian was able to maintain control over the empire for a time. However, his abdication in 305 CE and the succession of his co-emperors led to renewed conflicts. The end of the Tetrarchy and the chaos that followed brought about a new wave of power struggles. The Emperor Constantine I, or Constantine the Great, emerged as a pivotal figure during the 4th century CE. Constantine's reign marked a decisive turning point for the Roman Empire, as his political and religious reforms forever changed the empire's direction. Constantine's rise to power was not without difficulty. In 312 CE, he fought a pivotal battle at the Milvian Bridge against his rival, Maxentus, and emerged victorious. This victory, attributed to his vision of a Christian symbol, the Chi Rho in the sky, was a significant moment in his life. Constantine saw his victory as divinely ordained, and in a bold political move, became the first Roman emperor to embrace Christianity. In 313 CE, Constantine issued the Edict of Milan, which granted religious tolerance throughout the empire, thus ending the persecution of Christians. This was a monumental shift in the Roman Empire, as Christianity, once a persecuted faith, began to take root in the empire's institutions. Constantine's support for Christianity not only solidified his own power, but also transformed the religious landscape of the empire. In 330 CE, Constantine founded the city of Constantinople, modern-day Istanbul, which would become the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire and the center of the Byzantine Empire for the next 1,000 years. Constantine's reign did not end the empire's struggles. Though the Eastern Empire, centered in Constantinople, prospered for centuries, the Western Roman Empire began to crumble under the weight of its internal problems and external threats. The Western Empire faced increasing pressures from barbarian invasions, economic decline, and political instability. By the late 4th century, the Western Roman Empire was under constant threat from Goths, Vandals, Huns, and other barbarian tribes. The most significant of these invasions occurred in 410 CE, when the Visigoths, led by Alaric, sacked the city of Rome itself, a shocking event that symbolized the weakening of Roman power. In 455 CE, the Vandals followed suit, looting and pillaging the city once again. Meanwhile, the Eastern Roman Empire, later known as the Byzantine Empire, continued to thrive under leaders like Justinian I, but the gap between the two halves of the empire had grown too wide. The political, military, and economic resources of the West were spread too thin to defend against the growing tide of barbarian invasions. The Western Roman Empire, once the heart of the Roman world, officially fell in 476 CE when the last Roman emperor, Romulus Augustulus, was deposed by the Germanic chieftain Odoacer. This event marked the formal end of the Roman Empire in the West. While the fall of Rome was a devastating blow to the western half of the empire, the legacy of Rome lived on. The Eastern Roman Empire, or Byzantine Empire, continued to exist for nearly another 1,000 years until the fall of Constantinople in 1453 CE. Moreover, the cultural, legal, and political ideas of Rome influenced future civilizations, especially in Europe and the Middle East. Rome's achievements in law, governance, architecture, and military organization set the stage for the development of Western civilization. The Roman Republic's emphasis on law, citizenship, and civic duty was carried forward into the ideas of the Enlightenment and modern democratic systems. The Roman Empire's infrastructure, including roads, aqueducts, and cities, shaped the development of urban civilization for centuries. Even as the empire crumbled, the Roman Catholic Church, which had gained increasing influence under Constantine and his successors, preserved much of Rome's cultural and religious legacy. The Church would go on to become a unifying force in medieval Europe, helping to maintain aspects of Roman law, culture, and Christianity long after the fall of the empire.